Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Pero, why do you need to go there? What are you planning to do there? Asked Alice when her husband called her and informed her that he was going to their hometown for a few days. Her reaction to his upcoming trip did not surprise him at all. Pedro understood that his wife no longer loved him. And as much as he wanted to regain his past feelings, it was impossible. He realized it as soon as the monstrous illness struck him, still a relatively young and successful man. Learning about the diagnosis, Pedro was ready to sink through the ground. "Doctor, how can this be?" he asked, looking at the doctor with pleading, hopeful eyes. "Can't anything be done at all? I have money, a lot of money. I will pay for any treatment, any surgery. Damn it, I'm willing to give everything just to live." But the doctor couldn't give Pedro any positive prognosis. "Señor Lagos, you came too late," the doctor shook his head. "If you had come a few months earlier, maybe there would have been some discussion, but now, unfortunately, I can only offer you therapy. It's too late for surgery. But I can guarantee you won't experience the horrible pain that people in your condition usually face." "Thank you for the consolation," the man thought to himself. He left the doctor in a terrible mood and immediately called his assistant, Silvio. "Urgently contact all the foreign clinics. Find everything you can on the internet." "Did something happen?" asked Silvio, who had faithfully served his boss for years. "Is someone sick?" "Silvio, please don't ask unnecessary questions. Just do what I say. I'll tell you everything later." When he came home, he immediately encountered Alice, who also bombarded him with questions. "You look like you've seen a ghost today," observed his wife. "What's wrong? Trouble?" Their relationship had long become distant and cool, so Pedro was genuinely surprised by his wife's interest. "Why are you suddenly asking?" he replied with a question, but after thinking for a few minutes, he decided to tell his wife about the diagnosis the doctor had given him. Let her know, he thought to himself. There's nothing to hide now. Alice listened to her husband and couldn't believe her ears. "What will happen now, Pero?" She put on a caring look. "Maybe we should go abroad? There are good doctors there, they will definitely help you." "Thanks," exclaimed Pedro. "I wouldn't have known what to do without you. I've already instructed Silvio, he'll call the clinics. And now, please, leave me alone." "Ugh, as if I needed you," Alice thought to herself indignantly. "Why won't you get lost?" She was pondering this not because she was offended by her husband. She really couldn't care less about what was happening to him. But Alice had no intention of divorcing Señor Lagos under any circumstances. He was too good of a catch. Besides, she wasn't young anymore. After all, she had given him the best years of her life and had every right to enjoy the benefits that her husband could provide now. Their family life began modestly. When they met, the future businessman and millionaire was just simple student, with not a penny to his name. A dignified life seemed like a distant dream. It was out of the question. The newcomer of this city worked nights to afford rent and food. How he dreamed of escaping this reality. He pushed himself to work tirelessly, just awaiting the day when the loathsome poverty would be a thing of the past, clinging to any opportunity. This is what attracted Alice to him, a young student who sometimes couldn't even afford new stockings. After many years, she could hardly believe they once spent evenings in a shabby rented room with tattered wallpaper and insects. So much time had passed, it felt like an eternity. Alice, like her husband, also loved money. They were the meaning of life for her. And even though she had a sufficient amount, Alice feared losing them. At one point, Pedro found his bearings. If he hadn't taken the risk and followed his friend's advice into business, he'd still be toiling as a simple engineer for a modest salary compared to his current income. Alice never managed to build a worthy career. Her diploma turned out to be completely useless. As her husband started to rise, she focused entirely on ensuring his success. Pedro felt guilty towards his wife for her inability to achieve anything in life and for the fact that in their family they had everything except the most important thing. Over the years of marriage, Alice still hadn't become a mother, and Pedro rightfully blamed himself for constantly saying, "Not yet, not yet." He was convinced of this when they lived in that shabby rented room. His stance remained the same even after they finally moved into their own small apartment, the first home Pedro managed to save up for. At that time, he had been in business for about 2 years. Though compared to the meager wages he earned at his job after graduation, the money he earned in business was staggering. It still wasn't enough for the life he deemed worthy. To reach the necessary level, Pedro had to work tirelessly for several more years, while youth and health slipped away not only from him but also from his wife, who desperately wanted children but couldn't have them. Pedro knew he was largely to blame. He felt like a madman who had worked tirelessly for years, only to end up with nothing. Money was there, but happiness never came. What else was needed for that? As it turned out, a lot. When the family began to crack at the seams and a fatal diagnosis fell like snow on Pedro's head, he reevaluated his life. Every day he regretted his actions, which he considered less than noble. But at the same time, with each passing day, the man's character became increasingly unbearable. Mood swings intensified, and occasional uncontrollable aggression surfaced. Alice couldn't bear it anymore. She started persuading her husband to see a psychologist for the necessary support. She was tired of fearing for herself and her life. Alice feared that sooner or later Pedro would completely lose control, and then something irreversible might happen. She didn't warn her husband that she was moving to her own apartment, which Pedro had given her for her 30th birthday. Alice was afraid Pedro might cause a scene, accuse her of abandoning him. He did it anyway, but over the phone, which was at least safe for Alice. "So that's it. You've decided to abandon your sick husband to fate and live separately. Wonderful, but why is that? Had enough? When I was healthy, I was needed, but now suddenly I'm not. Is that how it is? Pero, stop the hysteria right now." Alice shouted into the receiver. "I understand everything, but you should also understand me. The illness affects not only your physical but also your psychological state. I'm just scared to be around you. Look at you, coming up with excuses. Just admit it, you're tired of living under the same roof with a sick husband, smelling the unpleasant scents of medications, injections. And physically, I haven't satisfied you in a long time. Probably you've already found someone else. Tell me the truth. I won't be offended, so why hide it?" Her husband's words deeply offended Alice. Yes, perhaps the love between them had long faded, but that didn't mean he could treat her like this. To suspect her of infidelity was too much. She had never even looked at other men. Maybe I'm wrong? She asked herself after the unpleasant conversation with Señor Lagos came to an end. If he can treat me like this, why can't I treat him badly? Why should I tolerate such treatment? I gave him the best years of my life, and he didn't even let me have children. And now I have to listen to his stream of filth. Pedro's condition worsened with each passing day, but he didn't want to show his weakness to anyone. While he treated the daily injections administered by the nurse and the weekly visits to the doctor as a necessary evil, he didn't even consider seeking help from a psychologist. Am I crazy? He asked himself, sitting in front of the mirror, where a man with a disheveled look and huge circles under his eyes looked back at him. Everything's fine with me. I even managed to work in this condition. His attitude towards such help changed after he started experiencing hallucinations in addition to his unstable state. The moment a girl in a white dress appeared to Pedro in his dream for the first time, he was truly frightened. "Phew!" he exclaimed, jumping off the couch. "I thought I was dead and gone, ended up who knows where." She was insanely beautiful. Coming to him in a dream, she would place her hand on his shoulder and whisper something in his ear, but he couldn't make out what it was. When Pedro woke up, he desperately tried to recall the words of the stranger, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember anything. Is this serious? Have I gone mad? He asked himself when he invited a psychotherapist to his home, whose phone number he got from an old acquaintance. Confidentiality was very important to Senor Lagos. No one from his circle should know what was happening to him. In public, he tried his best to control himself to avoid outbursts, but when he came home, he felt like he was losing his mind. Maybe Alice did the right thing by leaving? He pondered to himself. After the session with the psychotherapist, Pedro suddenly felt guilty towards his wife and for his current behavior, and for the past. It's my fault she never became a mother, he reproached himself. The sessions weren't in vain. After talking to the psychotherapist, Pedro felt lighter and lighter. He stopped losing control and psyching out, feeling calm and confident again. This is what he needed. Now he perceived his illness completely differently, as an inevitability. Pedro was no longer afraid of impending death. He reasoned about it philosophically. He stopped getting angry at his wife. Even if she found someone else, so be it, he thought. Is she not human? Everything happens in life. He understood that Alice no longer felt the same way about him as before. Over the years of their life together, which had its fair share of not only happy but also difficult moments, her attitude towards her husband changed. Partly, he was to blame for this himself, but returning to the past seemed impossible, and Senor Lagos had no future, so he accepted this cruel reality as it was, without strong emotions or resentment towards fate. One thing remained unchanged. In his dreams, the same girl still came to the man, whose face he could not remember. She was very beautiful, but when Pedro woke up, he couldn't recall any features of her face, nor her smile, nothing that he wanted to, trying repeatedly to reproduce in his memory by closing his eyes. You need to stop taking this so seriously, said the psychotherapist when Pedro again told him about seeing the stranger in his dream during another session. It's just a dream. Your subconscious mind reproduces what you would like to see in real life and nothing more. Are you saying that in real life I would like to see a bride in a wedding dress? The man was surprised. I've been married for many years and I'm not planning to divorce. Remarrying is not in my plans either. Why this silly dream? Why haunt me with this image? There were more questions than answers. Pedro hoped that with time, he would stop being bothered by the unknown girl in his dreams in a wedding dress, but the visions continued, though he started to take them much calmer. And this was the merit of the psychotherapist who taught him to perceive the recurring image as a dream, instilling this thought in his mind. What a shock Pedro experienced when he met the mysterious stranger in reality. It was something incredible, extraordinary. Seeing her, he initially couldn't believe that the girl was standing right before his eyes. He didn't remember her face, but he was more than sure that it was her. No other girl could just appear to him. From that moment, a new life began for the man, one he couldn't even think of. He didn't wait, didn't guess, and everything turned upside down in an instant. It happened so unexpectedly that the realization of the events of those months came to Pedro only after several years, when they became a distant past. At that period of his life, he wasn't up to realizations. Pedro faced a long struggle for himself and his right to exist, of which he had no idea. When several months later the doctor announced that there was no hope and none of the foreign clinics Silvio contacted agreed to accept a patient with such a diagnosis even for examination, Pedro accepted his fate with an uncharacteristic humility. By that time, he had more or less restored his relationship with Alice and occasionally talked to her. The woman never returned home. To distract herself from anxious thoughts and somehow come to her senses, she got heavily involved in renovating and arranging the new apartment. Pedro changed his attitude towards her departure. After all, she had every right to do so. She couldn't live under the same roof with a husband who had fallen into psychosis and neurosis. He decided to tell her that he was planning to go say goodbye to his mother, his only close relative. She passed away several years ago. A severe illness sent the woman, who cherished and valued life, to the other world within a few months. Senora Lagos raised Pedro alone. He never saw his father, Mom didn't like talking about him, and he didn't insist, respecting her feelings and not wanting to touch a sore spot. Pedro understood that there was some unpleasant history with his father. He saw it in his mother's reaction and realized even in his teenage years when he first dared to ask about his father. Alice reacted cautiously to her husband's plans and didn't hide it. "Are you planning to go there alone?" she asked. "Will you take Silvio with you at least? What if you feel bad? What about the injections?" There was nothing good about this imaginary concern. Pedro understood that Alice was not divorcing him for one reason only: she wanted to inherit all his wealth, which was fair enough. And he didn't want to divorce her either, despite realizing that their relationship would never be the same. Who, if not her, deserved to receive all the assets and real estate after his death? Pedro had no children, no close relatives. Only his mother, who had long been in the grave, but she definitely couldn't inherit anything. She didn't need her son's millions anymore, and she never claimed them in her lifetime. But Alice was a completely different matter. But because of the strained relationship with Sonora Lagos, which had long been in the past, the woman didn't want her husband to go to their hometown in such a condition. After all, if there was a chance to live at least a month longer than the doctor indicated, based on his calculations, it should be seized. And the trip could worsen Pedro's already difficult condition: nerves, stress, the road. "Who needs this?" Alice asked. "Like, don't be offended, but your mother is dead. She doesn't care if you say goodbye to her or not, but the extra stress might make you go to her sooner than expected. In fact, you'll dig your own grave earlier than planned. Think about it." But Pedro was unwavering. He didn't take Alice's words seriously. She wouldn't understand him because her mother was alive. And though the woman lived in another city, and they rarely communicated, still. Alice didn't see her mother stiffened, didn't throw the last handful of soil on the grave before burying a loved one forever. She hadn't yet been given the opportunity to understand what feelings a child experiences burying his mother, and thank God. "I'll only be gone for a few days," Pedro reassured his wife. "And what stress are we talking about? I have a place to stay, and the plane, it's fast. I'll sit down and in an hour I'll be out. Don't worry, everything will be fine." He replied to her with the same cliched phrases she used to talk to him. And what else could he say? He could not say goodbye to his mother. And though Pedro felt bad and had very little strength, he still made a firm decision to go. Right after the conversation with his wife, he asked Silvio to buy tickets, and the very next day he went to his hometown. Imagine, Pedro thought to himself, crossing the threshold of his old mother's apartment. Nothing has changed here in all these years. This thought flashed through his mind every time he came to his hometown. Sonora Lagos did not abandon her modest abode until the very last day of her life. Her son repeatedly suggested that she move in with him or at least renovate, but she flatly refused. Why go through all this? She wondered. Dust, dirt, noise, fuss. Who needs it? I'm not young anymore, and I'll live out my days just fine as it is. I have a roof over my head, and that's good enough. Some people don't even have that. Sonora Lagos loved perfect order. And even when the woman's vitality was fading, she still continued to get the apartment to perfection. Of course, Pedro was her only heir, to whom this small apartment passed immediately after his mother's death. But he didn't need it. By that time, he could afford to buy any housing he wanted. And surely a man who had overcome so many difficulties and trials on his way could never even think about asking himself this question: who needs all this now? Why go through all this? What for? He decided not to postpone going to the cemetery. Pedro had a few days to spare, and he wanted to spend them with his mother, so he didn't even rest from the journey. He threw his bag with his modest belongings, which he took with him for a few days, into the apartment and immediately went to the flower shop. As always, your favorites, Mom, he thought to himself, gathering a bouquet of flowers. I know you loved simple wildflowers in life. There were more than enough of such flowers in local stores, the largest selection Pedro had ever seen. Thanking the saleswoman, he walked to the cemetery on foot. He could have driven there, but he didn't want to. It was better to walk and breathe fresh air. Here it wasn't as stuffy as in the big city. The cemetery was quiet. There was nobody around. The guard booth, where a man was supposed to watch over the visitors to the graves, was closed. This didn't surprise Senor Lagos. Who needs to closely watch over visitors for a measly salary? They don't graffiti on the graves, and that's a relief, he reasoned to himself, and was partly right. The guard's pay was meager, so he spent whole days staring at a small television he brought with him into the booth and drinking coffee with sandwiches. And who could blame him for that? It was just silly. A man is born for wealth and happiness, Pedro always said in his childhood and youth when Senora Lagos told him that not everything was rosy. They were so different in character. The worldviews of the mother and son were also very different. But despite all this, they always lived very harmoniously, never argued. Pedro did everything not to upset his mother. He was the perfect son. How she was proud of him when he achieved success in life. How he missed her. Well, Mom, I've come. Pedro sighed and sat down on the bench he had thoughtfully placed near the grave. He organized his mother's funeral to the highest degree. He ordered the most expensive monument, a fence. And why is all this necessary? Alice asked at the time, watching as the man, unable to find his place, ran around all the funeral bureaus in search of what he needed. The dead don't care what stone the slab standing over their grave is made of, and all this is so outdated anyway. Pedro let his wife's remarks go in one ear and out the other. He didn't expect anything else from her. Alice was a staunch supporter of cremation. It's economical and environmentally friendly, she said. No, there could be no cremation in Senora Lagos's case. She was a religious person and even asked her son to bury her properly while she was still alive, and Pedro fulfilled his promise to his mother. Let your soul rest in peace, he said, tossing a handful of soil into the grave. Alice watched all this with her typical incomprehension and surprise, and when they left the cemetery, she said, "If I die before you, then cremate me. I don't want to lie on the ground and rot. Such a prospect doesn't please me at all." "But you said the dead don't care," Pedro replied then. "So it turns out, no, it's not all the same." "Don't nitpick my words," the woman waved off. Then they were still a real family, not just on paper. But now everything has changed. Interesting, if I ask, will she even bury me or cremate me without batting an eyelid, he thought to himself, but after a few minutes, he pushed these thoughts away. Oh, why bother? Pedro asked himself. Came to mother and sit and reason about some nonsense. Selfish wretch. For the next 2 hours, he sat and talked to his mother. Pedro did it so quietly that only he could hear his whisper. He didn't complain about life. On the contrary, he even looked forward to seeing her soon. "I haven't seen you for so many years, Mom, and now there's a chance. So fate has decreed. Are you happy?" He would ask, looking at the tombstone, but all he heard in response was silence. Pedro was so engrossed in the conversation that he didn't even notice a girl appear on the neighboring grave. Turning around, he nearly fainted. My God, this just can't be, he thought in his head. At first, Pedro thought he was hallucinating. This is probably the next stage after weird dreams. It'll pass soon, he reassured himself. But when he turned to the neighboring grave a few minutes later, he saw the same girl again. She was a spitting image of the bride who visited him in his dreams. In a white wedding dress with a veil on her head, she sat by the grave, covering her face with her hands, crying bitterly. No, what nonsense, the man continued to reason. Who goes to the cemetery like this? It's just absurd. I must be imagining things. I wonder, when visions become reality, is it very serious? Does what happened mean that I'm mentally ill? The thought of having lost his mind scared Pedro himself. He was ready for anything but this. A man accustomed to always doing everything clearly and definitely, and for whom sound mind and clear memory were the main priorities in life, sat on the grave and watched the girl, pondering whether she was a ghost or not. Unfathomable to the mind. After a few minutes, when Pedro finally realized that the vision wasn't disappearing, he decided to approach the stranger. And at that moment, when he put his hand on her shoulder and she screamed in fright, the man really almost lost his mind. Talking ghost. "Oh no, not this!" he yelled. The stranger looked at the man as if he were crazy. He realized this when their eyes met. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" the girl asked when Pedro finally pulled himself together and calmed down. She could wait, patient. The man couldn't say for sure how much time had passed since his hysteria began, but definitely not less than 20 minutes. All this time, the stranger sat by the grave and observed the behavior of the stranger, who was completely unaware of his own actions. The tears on the girl's cheeks dried up. She even almost managed to cope with her inner state, which was so heavy that just some time ago she could only cry and blame the universe for such a cruel fate. Someone is clearly worse off, she said to herself, seeing what was happening with Pedro. Curiosity got the better of the girl, so she didn't hesitate to ask the man about what interested her. Well, since they met, two lonely souls, why not talk? You see, the man replied, I don't know how to tell you. Just say it as it is already, Eve interrupted him. Why beat around the bush? If you have something to say it, don't be shy. You appeared in my dreams, Pedro blurted out unexpectedly to himself and told the stranger about his visions. Listening carefully to him, the girl laughed. Not about you, she clarified, seeing the man looking at her offendedly and sincerely, not understanding the reason for such joy. I'm laughing at the villainous fate. How banal and stupid everything is. Oh well, to hell with it, she waved her hand. I'll go from here, I've lingered. Wait. Something happened to you, right? You're in such a state at the cemetery. Well, admit it, how should I put it more delicately, unusual, isn't it? And when I approached you, you were crying. People don't just cry like that. Tell me what happened. Maybe I can help you with something. Pedro was genuinely interested in the condition and affairs of the stranger. He cared about this girl's fate. If she really got into a difficult situation, he could do everything in his power just to help her. How else? People are needed to help each other. Eve's story was straightforward. Such things happen all the time. This is life, and there's nothing special about betrayal and meanness. It seemed like, what tragedy is it that the groom left? So what? Aren't there enough guys in the world? One, another, a third, there will be dozens more like him. But no. Eve was completely different. She sincerely believed in true love, which happens once and for a lifetime. And certainly, the girl did not expect a grand scandal on the day of her wedding, for which she had been preparing for so long and carefully. Eve met her fiancé by chance. They met at a cafe where the girl worked hard to earn money and provide for herself and her elderly grandmother, who raised her alone. The girl went to work immediately after school. There was nothing to wait for. Eva had no chance of getting an education. Who would feed and clothe the poor orphan during the long 5 years she would spend at the university? By the time Eve received her diploma, Senora Botella was no longer young. Grandma complained more and more often about her health, which was failing her day by day. The pension was meager, and the woman struggled to make ends meet, but she never blamed her daughter for bringing her into the world when she was well over 30. Only the woman did not even imagine what a risk it was. If I had known, I would never have given birth, she said, hardly upset when, 2 years after Eve's birth, the doctor pronounced an unfavorable diagnosis to the woman. She was fading away before her eyes and couldn't think of anything except her daughter's future. Who will feed and raise Eve now? Nuria reproached her mother, who had urged her to keep the child alive. Who will take care of her? I'll take care of her, sweetheart, I will. Senora Botella assured the woman. Eve will never be alone. I'll do everything for her, everything I can. I promise you. And if you don't live to see her adulthood? Nuria continued to press. What then? The orphanage? Good thinking, can't argue with that. May you be silenced. How dare you speak like that? I will live and raise her, I promise, exclaimed Sonora Botella, and she kept her word. The woman worked tirelessly until her health allowed, but then she fell ill. Eve understood how difficult it was for her grandmother, and she wanted to finish school as quickly as possible and get a job to support herself independently. Forgive me, my girl, forgive me, lamented Sonora Botella, who in the last year of her life was so weak that she could hardly get out of bed. I couldn't give you a decent education, doomed you to poverty. Your mother was right when she told me I couldn't. If I had kept working until now, I could have seen you through college, but now... Forgive me, my girl, if you can. What are you talking about? Protested Eve. Education, a great value indeed. Nothing terrible. People live without diplomas, they work, and earn even more than all those smart Alecs. And I'll live, won't fall apart. And then, if there's a chance, I'll get a degree. What are my years for? Sonora Botella was very ashamed that her granddaughter had to work day and night just to get a piece of bread for herself and for her. Working in the cafe was hard, but quite bearable. They paid relatively well compared to other jobs in the city, where people had to toil for literal pennies. Sometimes Eve even managed to save something. The girl was sure that meeting Manuel would change her destiny. The day they met, a young and very promising man came to the cafe to have breakfast. He had just quarreled with his parents that morning, and his mood was so bad that he didn't even want to go to college. How long will they keep nagging me and interfering in my life? He angrily reasoned. I'm already an adult and I'll figure out what to do and how to live on my own. And now that fool, Mari, is trying to marry me off. You see, her father has a business adjacent to mine, and our marriage is beneficial for the family. Damn them all. Immersed in his thoughts, Manuel didn't even notice Eve approaching him. What will you have? She repeated the standard question for the third time. The young man responded only after the girl put her hand on his shoulder. Are you feeling unwell? Should I call an ambulance? She asked, seeing that he wasn't responding to her words. Oh, no, Manuel finally spoke up. Sorry, lost in thought. I'll have coffee and the menu, please. I'm very hungry. Here it is, Eve smiled and pushed the thick folder closer to the young man. Oh, excuse me again, he muttered. I'll call you when I've made my choice. When Eve brought coffee to the young man, he literally bombarded her with menu questions. She explained everything to him in detail, as she should, and putted the names of all the ordered dishes in a small notepad. Manuel seemed interesting and courteous to her. It couldn't be said that she fell in love with him at first sight, but he definitely aroused sympathy in her, so when he came to the cafe again and asked Eve for her phone number, she didn't refuse. At that moment, he didn't understand what he was doing to spite his father and mother, who were already asleep and saw their son down the aisle with Mari. Their relationship with Eve was developing rapidly, which Manuel's parents didn't like at all. If you marry this girl without kith or kin, forget about any money, his father said sternly. I'll disinherit you, mark my words. You'll build your family nest in a rented room in a communal apartment. Oh, as if I would be scared, Manuel waved off, unable to imagine a day without his father's money. He was sure his father was bluffing and making such threats out of anger. When he gets married, Dad will cool down and remember that Manuel is his only son and there won't be another. How can you leave your only son without a penny in his pocket? In the imagination of the young and quite spoiled guy, this was impossible. Eve, on the other hand, did not claim his money. She really loved Manuel with all her heart, and for her, accustomed to a modest life, there was certainly no fear of having to start from scratch. There won't be any room in a communal apartment, she chuckled. My grandmother and I have our own apartment. We'll manage somehow. But a few months after their acquaintance, Sonora Botella died suddenly. Eve was left completely alone, and Manuel was her only close person, whom she could rely on and count on. At least that's what she thought back then when she loved him and believed in him unconditionally. And how long have you been working? He casually asked Eve. Oh, it's been 3 years already, the girl replied, not understanding why this mattered. My grandmother raised me alone. She had poor health and couldn't work, and her pension was small. So, I had to get a job at a cafe right after school. Hearing how much Eve earned, Manuel was almost speechless. He usually spent this much in a day. Of course, such a life would definitely not suit him, and he understood that, so until the last moment, he hoped for his father's leniency. Senor Montoya, however, wasted no time. His wife, Sonora Montoya, who was also vehemently against their son marrying a girl from outside their circle, fully supported her husband in everything. They both knew that Mari was in love with Manuel like a cat and just waited for her parents to arrange their marriage. That's what they decided to play. Well, you understand that this is foolishness and folly, reasoned Sonora Montoya, inviting the girl for a confidential conversation, to which she immediately agreed to come home to her future relatives. He's just showing character. It's maximalism. Mari has no other bride and can't have one except you. That's what we decided, which means you have every right to intervene in the situation. Maria preferred not to rush events. She hovered before the eyes of the young man at various events, which, like him, she attended with her parents, and hoped that sooner or later Manuel himself would notice such a desirable bride. But time passed, and the young man's attitude towards her did not change. What difference does it make? We'll get married anyway, she persuaded herself, knowing that her parents had already arranged the wedding. Love is a matter of acquisition. It will come, I'm sure of it. Naturally, Manuel didn't delve into the details of his complicated relationship with his family. To Eva about Mari and the fact that they wanted to marry him off to her, and this issue was settled, the young man did not say a word. He brazenly lied that Eva was his first love, and sooner or later, relations with the parents would improve. They would accept his choice, and for now, he would live as he pleased. There was nothing wrong with that. Eva didn't understand whom he was trying to convince more, her or himself. She could live in any conditions, but he. The girl was afraid that it would be difficult for Manuel to exist in conditions he wasn't accustomed to, and sooner or later, this could be the cause of their breakup, which she really didn't want. But everything happened much sooner than she could have imagined. How surprised Eva was when Mari showed up at the wedding, whom she didn't even know about, and caused a grand scandal, claiming that Eva had stolen her man from under her nose, and he was promised to her. Without any restraint in her expressions, Maria insulted Eva with the last words. She couldn't even imagine herself standing on the threshold of the registry office, offended and spat upon. The parents had prepared for their son's wedding in advance. Despite the rather complicated relationship between them, Manuel invited his father and mother to the celebration. They replied that they would see, and if they had time, they would definitely come. You know how we feel about all this, said Sonora Montoya. We would be very happy if you didn't get married, but you're already an adult, it's your decision, and there's nothing we can do about it. The parents were sure that their son would break down at most a week after moving in with Eva, a decision that was made so suddenly that it shocked both Sonora Montoya and Andrei Viktorovic. Son, I know you. You won't be able to live like this, the woman cried. Well, at least you have a roof over your head, but what will you live on? Buy groceries? You're not used to this. Why do you need all this? Why did you go against us? If you change your mind, everything will go back to the way it was, I promise you. But Manuel didn't even want to think about changing his mind. The young man was sure that he would have to endure deprivation for a couple of months after the wedding. Then the parents would start to miss him, the mother would regularly nag the father, and the young man knew firsthand how she could do it, and he would calm down and continue to sponsor his son. Manuel couldn't even imagine what they had planned, and when he realized it, it was already too late. So is he getting married after all? Mari asked indignantly when Sonora Montoya called her and informed her of the upcoming wedding. You said you would never decide on this. So you were wrong, weren't you? Yes, the woman answered vexedly. Unfortunately, it seems so. I'm in shock myself. When he moved in with her, I was sure he'd run away from there within a week. He seemed to have settled in, and he no longer feels like he's traded a rich, carefree life for poverty and hopelessness. But enough about that, Mari. But you understand that this is your and our last chance, don't you? We have to do something about this before it's too late. Terrifying images were already flashing before Sonora Montoya's eyes, like her son dropping out of college and working two low-paying, unskilled jobs just to support the children. She couldn't bear to imagine that, and she was ready to do anything just to ensure her boy never faced such a future. Meanwhile, Mari was jealousy tormented. She was deeply offended. How could this be? How dare he choose not her, a girl from a good family who deserved a worthy groom like no one else, but some ragtag without kin or kind? It didn't make sense to Maria, and she decided to act. The wedding was planned to be modest. Due to the conflict with the parents, there shouldn't even have been any guests. Eva had no one to invite, and as it turned out, Manuel had neither friends nor relatives. Well, it's not a big deal, the girl said. At least we won't spend any money. That's wonderful. Manuel was upset by this economy. This wasn't how he imagined his wedding, but the young man continued to convince himself that they would still have a celebration when the parents came to their senses, and they would go on a honeymoon trip, and everything would work out, just a little later. They just needed to wait a bit. Manuel didn't expect Maria to show up at the wedding and cause a scene. But the young man immediately understood where the wind was blowing from. "What are you doing here?" he asked indignantly. "Who sent you here? The parents? Did they tell you we're getting married today?" "Of course they did. Who else could it be? Get out of here immediately, do you hear me? Go away." Manuel tried to push Maria away, but he couldn't. Eva stood in his way, and while everything that was happening was a complete surprise to her, she was simultaneously consumed by a terrible curiosity. "Why are you getting so worked up?" she wondered. "Why don't we hear what this lovely girl has to say, since she's here anyway? We shouldn't kick her out. Let her say whatever she wants." Maria was seething with anger. She was pathologically jealous, and if she had a grip on Manuel like a vice, she had no intention of giving him up to another woman under any circumstances. And she couldn't care less that he didn't love her. For the girl, mutual feelings were such a trivial matter that she didn't consider it a compelling argument not to go to the altar. Eva learned so much new listening to Maria. The insults that the failed groom-to-be hurled at her didn't affect her at all. They didn't bother her in the slightest. But the fact that Manuel turned out to be a liar seriously upset Eva. So, when Maria's passionate speech came to an end and the girl calmed down a bit, Eva asked her to step aside. "We need to talk," she said, "alone. It won't take long. And then he's yours. Take him and roll off in any direction you like. I'm not keeping you." Manuel was outraged by the bride's behavior. When they stepped aside, the young man looked at her reproachfully and asked, "What do you mean by yours? What is this supposed to mean? Am I some object to be passed from hand to hand? Why didn't you tell me anything?" Eva exclaimed indignantly. "Why didn't you tell me that your parents had arranged with this girl's parents for you to marry her, that you were promised to her? Or will you say it doesn't matter?" "I'll say," Manuel exclaimed. "And what does it matter? Are we in the Middle Ages, when parents forcibly married their children off and rejoiced in life? What century are we living in? Wake up. The fact that she came here and caused a scene means only one thing. You didn't make it clear to her that you weren't going to marry her, you didn't say anything, you didn't explain. It's despicable, Manolo. Neither I nor she deserve such treatment. Don't you think so? Or were you planning to sit on two chairs all your life? I don't understand what you wanted, what result you expected. Sooner or later, it all had to end, and it did. Is that what you wanted? So you're leaving me because of this crazy woman who suddenly decided she's my bride?" Manuel asked. Are you out of your mind? Why all of a sudden? There's nothing between me and her. We've never had anything, and now you're ready to ruin everything over such nonsense? No, Eva replied. I'm not leaving you. You betrayed me. Deceived me and betrayed me. Why didn't you tell me everything right away? Why should I feel like a fool? Or did you not know you were supposed to marry her? Sort out your family arrangements yourselves. I don't want to see or hear from you anymore. Come get your stuff, and that's it. I didn't expect such treachery from you. But what can I do? Apparently, that's my fate, to be betrayed by the one I love. Eva ran away from the registry office and, reaching the cemetery, sat on a bench near her mother's and grandmother's graves. The women were buried side by side, as Sonora Botella had requested during her lifetime. I want to lie next to my dear daughter, she used to say long before her life force left her. The plot was purchased several years in advance so that no one would take it. Before her death, the woman was absolutely calm, knowing she would be buried as she wanted. But she worried about her granddaughter's fate, constantly saying she didn't like Manuel, whom she met shortly before she gave her soul to God. How right you were, grandmother, Eva whispered through tears, sitting by the grave. Why didn't I listen to you? It was a rhetorical question to which Eva had no answer. Sonora Botella, perhaps, would have been happy to help her, but she could no longer. During her lifetime, she said that Manuel impressed her as a cunning and insincere person, and she turned out to be right. I wonder what he was even hoping for. Eva thought bitterly to herself, unable to come to terms with it. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The girl couldn't calm down. And if it hadn't been for this stranger she accidentally bumped into at the cemetery, Eva might have retreated into herself and plunged into the deepest depression. Having listened to the man's story, which he immediately told her after she finished her narrative, the girl was deeply moved to the core. Eva realized that there are people who are much worse off than her, and one of them is in dire need of her help. Eva sincerely pitied him, a person who, like her, was completely alone, but also fatally ill and devoid of any hope. I really want to help you, she confessed. But I don't know how. You've already helped me, Pedro smiled. Just talking to you, and somehow it became easier. He was glad that the girl calmed down and stopped crying. The man felt the same touching pity for her as she did for him. Suddenly, the thought came to his mind, why not invite her to his place? Eva didn't want to go back to her grandmother's apartment. At any moment, Manuel could come there, with whom she still had to meet at least once. The young man probably wouldn't leave his things with Eva, so she had no doubt he would come to pick them up. I don't know, she hesitated when Pedro voiced his offer. It's somehow strange. Don't think anything bad, said the man, when he understood why Eva was hesitating. I didn't mean anything like that. I just think that right now we need each other. Human support is always important, especially in our circumstances. Such thoughts never crossed Eva's mind. She saw that Pedro was a very good and decent person. After thinking for a few more minutes, she agreed to go with him and didn't regret it at all. Talking to the man was easy and straightforward. During their conversation, Eva felt like they had known each other for a long time. Pedro understood her without many words. She felt such strong support from him, like never before. If you want, you can come with me, he said. You'll live there, get settled, find a job. What's waiting for you here? And there are opportunities, prospects, a completely different life. I'll help you. What are you talking about? Eva exclaimed in surprise. Where would I go? I have everything here, my apartment, my job. And anyway, Señor Lagos, how can I just leave everything behind? Oh, come on, you have nothing to leave behind, Pedro waved his hand. And stop calling me Señor, we're not that far apart in age, and I feel like an old man when you talk like that. Okay, nodded Eva, feeling uncomfortable addressing an adult informally, but she didn't want to make him uncomfortable. That day, they talked about something else. Eva couldn't even remember what exactly they discussed, but she had never felt so free and easy. Their heartfelt conversation was interrupted by a phone call, which came as a complete surprise to Pedro. "Silvio, I asked not to disturb me," the man said, displeased, hearing the assistant's voice on the other end of the line. "Sorry, Senor Lagos," Silvio replied apologetically. "I remember you asked, but this is very urgent, so I decided to call you." "Well, what happened?" Pedro asked. "Don't drag it out, just tell me already." "They called from the clinic. Remember, you asked me to contact all possible foreign clinics for examination? So, one of them called today and said they're ready to accept you." Pedro couldn't believe his ears. He asked Silvio to repeat what he said several times to make sure he didn't mishear him. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Pedro said abruptly and hung up. Eva had only a few hours left to make a decision that would change her entire future. "Oh, come on, why are you so worried?" Pedro asked as he and Eva were already seated on the plane. "Everything will be fine. Manuel took his things, you changed the locks. Trust me, you have nothing to worry about." But Eva couldn't stop thinking about whether her behavior was appropriate. She was flying to a foreign city with barely acquainted man and planning to stay at his house. It was completely unlike her, but it seemed like him. Unlike Eva, Pedro wasn't afraid of anything. For the first time in many months, he had hope of recovery, albeit faint, but hope, and he planned to cling to it with all his might just to survive. Whatever happened, he knew how to survive, and over the years of prosperous existence, this skill hadn't disappeared anywhere. He simply had to pull himself together and drive away the sudden illness that had befallen him to hell. At the airport, they were met by Silvio, whose face expressed surprise. He couldn't hide it, but he also didn't dare to comment on what was happening. "We're going to your place now, right?" The assistant clarified. "Am I right?" "Yes," Pedro replied. "Tell me what's going on with the clinic, because you were babbling on the phone, and I couldn't understand a thing." During all this time, Alice didn't call him once. And although only a few days had passed, for Pedro, it was an indicator that spoke volumes. What was all this pretense for? He pondered to himself, remembering how his wife pretended to be concerned about his trip to his hometown. What did she need all this for? In his head, he was already running through all the nuances of the divorce process. Even then, he understood that returning to the past was impossible, and there could be no talk of any further life together. He had to let her go, otherwise, nothing would work out. His thoughts were not connected with meeting Eva, although even then, deep down, he understood that they were unlikely to remain just friends who supported each other in difficult times. But the man didn't strive for a relationship. After all, there was too big an age difference between them. He had already turned 40. In a few months, Pedro would turn 36, 15 of which he had spent in legal marriage with Alice. Eva, on the other hand, was a young girl barely over 20. At that age, people usually date peers, although, on the other hand, one of them had already vividly demonstrated her irresponsibility and shamelessness, so Pedro had a chance to win the girl's heart, but he didn't want to impose himself. Upon arrival home, Pedro gave Eva the keys to the room where she would stay. This room was the only one in the house where he and Alice installed a lock in case guests came who were uncomfortable staying in a stranger's house without a lock. Pedro specifically allocated this room for Eva. He didn't want the girl to feel uncomfortable. "Thank you," she said admiringly. "It's very beautiful there." Eva had never seen such luxurious mansions in real life, only in movies. The girl was amazed by the beauty that now surrounded her. "I've always been curious about who lives in such houses," she chuckled over dinner. "I thought this only happened in movies." "Oh, come on," Pedro waved it off. "This isn't even the most luxurious mansion there could be. You haven't seen my friends' houses, but I think someday I'll show them to you, and you'll be equally amazed." "What did Silvio say?" Eva asked, wanting to change the subject. Of course, she was interested in the house and the interior, but it was all secondary. The most important thing was Senor Lagos's health, and she couldn't wait to find out what the doctor's prognosis was. "What did he say?" Pedro smiled. Nothing special. We need to go to the hospital tomorrow, collect medical history and all the documents, and then send them the scanned conclusions, excerpts, and images by mail. They'll review them, then give their verdict. And if there's even the slightest chance, then I'll have to fly for examination. He reasoned about it so calmly and matter-of-factly, as if it were some routine planned operation. Eva felt that Pedro had forgotten about being terminally ill and his life being at stake, but she was wrong. Pedro remembered it, he just didn't see the point in focusing on the illness. Somehow, he felt so light and calm that he simply didn't want to think about anything bad. Pedro felt that everything would be fine, and he had nothing more to worry about. When the clinic's response came 2 weeks later, he was convinced of this. So, you'll leave, and I'll stay? Eva sighed sadly when Pedro told her that the clinic was ready to accept him for examination, and Silvio had already booked a hotel and bought tickets. What am I going to do here alone? Well, you understand that I don't have time, the man replied, also regretting that he couldn't take Eva with him. To accompany me, you need to get a visa. It will take time, which, unfortunately, we don't have. People make appointments with the specialist who is ready to see me several months in advance. This is my only chance, which I can't miss. Of course, she understood everything, but she just couldn't imagine living alone in a stranger's house for so long. Pedro didn't know how long he would stay abroad. We'll see how it goes, he replied when Eva asked about it. If there's a possibility of surgery, then it's possible that I'll have to stay. I already told Silvio to take care of the paperwork for you. If circumstances arise that I have to spend several months abroad, then you'll come to me. Pedro had long thought about when to talk to Alice about divorce, before or after leaving. He was so confident in the successful outcome of the trip that he never doubted for a moment that he would return absolutely healthy from there. After weighing all the pros and cons, the man decided not to postpone the inevitable and called his wife before leaving. "Did you find a doctor?" exclaimed Alice. "I'm so happy, I congratulate you. I hope everything goes well. If someone finally agreed to examine and operate on you, then there is a chance of recovery." "That's wonderful." "Alice, listen to me," Pedro said. "I have to tell you something very important. Please don't interrupt me." "I'm listening carefully," his wife replied. "Go ahead." Upon hearing that he wanted a divorce, Alice didn't even ask why. Everything was already clear. Unnecessary, meaningless, and empty words were absolutely inappropriate. "I heard you," she said dryly when Pedro finished speaking. "I'm not surprised, it was expected. In fact, maybe it's for the best." When she left her husband's house and moved into her own apartment, for the first time in many years, she felt truly free. Alice was afraid to admit it to herself, but she increasingly found herself thinking that life without Pedro brought her pleasure. No longer did she have to adjust to his hectic work schedule, please him, or seek compromises. Apparently, over the years of marriage, she had become so tired of family life that she just wanted to enjoy solitude. And as soon as the opportunity presented itself, she immediately took advantage of it. As monstrous as it was to realize, Alice moved out from her husband not so much because she feared his bouts of uncontrollable aggression provoked by changes in his psychological state due to illness, but rather because at that moment she could do it. Until that moment, Alice had not had a single reason to move out and live separately. Like all women who had lived in marriage for many years, she feared divorce. Yes, Alice knew that Pedro wouldn't leave her high and dry, as he had informed her during the phone call, but that wasn't the main thing. Getting used to a new life and a new state of being turned out to be not so simple. However, Alice didn't expect it to be easy. She still treated Pedro well and was glad that they managed to maintain friendly relations, but their marriage had run its course. He understood it, she realized it. That's just how it happened after going through a lot of difficulties and trials. Two mature adults decided to divorce after 15 years of marriage, and such things happen in life. And there's no need to be surprised by that. Silvio will take care of preparing all the necessary documents, Pedro continued. Don't worry about the money. You've been by my side for a whole 15 years and rightfully deserve half of my estate. You'll be provided for until the end of your days. I won't shortchange you a penny, so rest assured." "I don't doubt that," Alice replied, still unable to come to terms with the situation, despite it being quite expected. Pedro didn't tell her about Eva living with him. Even if she comes to pick up her things or for some other reason and sees her, it's none of Alice's concern anymore, he thought to himself. He was convinced that he wasn't obligated to share the details of his life with his ex-wife anymore, and he wasn't obligated to account for himself to her either. Alice didn't encounter Eva. The woman only finalized her move a month after the conversation with her husband. By that time, Eva had already obtained her visa and flown to Senor Lagos. The man had just undergone surgery and needed care and support. "Honestly, I didn't expect you to come," he said. "Why?" The girl was surprised. "How could I do otherwise? I'm so glad they operated on you. Everything will be different now. As far as I understand, the doctor gave good prognosis, right? When will you be discharged?" "Not anytime soon," Pedro laughed. "The prognosis is good, but no one canceled the period of rehabilitation and recovery. So I still have to stay here for at least a month, maybe longer. I didn't expect you to come to me because I thought you'd take the opportunity. You'd move, look for a job, hang out with young people. After all, it's a big city with a lot of prospects. And here you are spending all your time on me. Won't you regret it later?" "Pero, what nonsense." Eva smiled. "What parties and prospects? That's not why I came. I wanted to support you. Money is, of course, good, but simple human care at such a difficult moment is much more important, agree?" "And then?" he asked, surprising himself by how easily he dared to ask her this question, which was worrying him so much. "What then?" Eva asked back. "Well, when I'm discharged and all this is over, will you go back, or will you find a job, or move somewhere else? What will you do then when I no longer need care and support?" Eva found it difficult to answer this question because she couldn't understand her feelings towards this man herself. Since their acquaintance, too little time had passed, and all the other events followed one after another in such a whirlwind. The girl hadn't even had time to realize that all this had really happened to her, not just in a dream. Just a little while ago, she thought she loved Manuel so much. She was so hurt when his true colors were revealed to her, his lies were so unpleasant, and now Eva felt like she had forgotten about this whole story altogether. Life had become filled with new events. She only thought about Senor Lagos's health constantly, and other thoughts simply didn't linger in her mind. But love. Maybe she just found him attractive. The age difference didn't scare Eva, she didn't consider it significant. That wasn't the main thing. The important thing was that she didn't really know him at all. That's what really worried her. Could one really talk about serious feelings for someone you've only known for a few weeks? Although, on the other hand, her relationship with Manuel also developed fairly quickly. But it was a mistake she didn't want to repeat. What if, this time too, she rushed and made a mistake again? What if Senor Lagos wasn't the person she needed? Eva didn't lie to Pedro, so she honestly said that she didn't know her future plans yet. "Honestly, I'm confused," she confessed. "Everything happened too unexpectedly and spontaneously. My measured life turned into real turmoil. I haven't gotten used to it yet." "It's okay," Pedro reassured the girl, noting to himself that she had told him the truth, and he was very glad about that. "Time will pass, everything will settle down. And don't just sit around here, go shopping. I told Silvio to give you one of my cards. There's so much interesting stuff here. When else will you have the chance to shop abroad?" And indeed, this was the first and perhaps the last such trip in Eva's life. But she didn't want to spend Senor Lagos's money. What right did she have to spend his money on shopping and entertainment? Who was she to squander his money like that? Besides, that's not why she came here, not at all. For 2 whole months she did not leave his bedside. Every day, as she woke up, went to the clinic, and only left in the evening. Eva read books to the man, talked to him heart to heart, took care of him as she could. During this time, he became truly close to her. With Senor Lagos, there was always something to talk about. He was a very interesting conversationalist. Such well-rounded people Eva had never encountered. And where could she find such an environment? In the cafe where she worked for 3 whole years, and where the same young people without education as herself were hired, or in school. Nowhere. All the people surrounding the girl were exactly like her. They all lived more or less the same way. In her school years, her family wasn't the only one who faced a shortage of money. Many dreamed of breaking free from it, but not many succeeded. Most of Eva's former classmates stayed in the same city and at the same level they were, and they couldn't change that. Yes, sighed Pedro, when Eva admired his deep knowledge in various areas and confessed that she had never met such people in her life. I understand you very well. I dreamed of more at your age, so I sent this gray reality to hell and finally got what I wanted. And our little town. Well, yes, there is a core of educated and wealthy people in it, but it's a very small layer of society. Most people live the way they live, and there's nothing you can do about it, but that's not just the case in our hometown. It's everywhere. That's life, and it's just the way it is, with its flaws, but all of that is so insignificant. Now Pedro perceived reality completely differently. After he narrowly escaped death and miraculously survived, he learned to find joy in the smallest things, a feeling that was absolutely new to him. Up until that moment, the man was used to demanding and getting everything from life. But now he never stopped thanking the universe for being alive. That was the most important thing. No money, nothing in the world was worth more than life. And after a successful surgery, he felt this more keenly than ever. Time flew by quickly. Eva didn't even have time to realize it, but she and Senor Lagos needed to return home. The heavy and hospital-bound weekdays were behind them, and what lay ahead was still unknown. "Why didn't you tell me you filed for divorce?" asked Eva, when upon their return, Pedro immediately immersed himself in business and paperwork. And indeed, why? He could have told her back then, in the hospital, but he didn't think it was necessary. Why? He couldn't understand himself. He didn't want to lie to Eva, so he told her the truth. "I don't know," he admitted. "Well, I only started the divorce process now. Before leaving, Alice and I just discussed all the details. It will take some time to process the documents. Either way, you would have caught on to this process." Of course, he was bending the truth a little. Pedro didn't want to tell Eva about filing for divorce for one simple reason, so she wouldn't think he was hinting at something. He himself didn't fully realize it and was afraid to admit to himself that he had fallen in love with Eva. She had similar feelings, but she didn't want to rush things. After some time, everything happened naturally. Several months later, Pedro finally decided to propose to the girl. It was quite unexpected for her. No, of course, Eva understood that sooner or later their relationship had to come to some logical and inevitable conclusion, but she didn't expect it to happen so soon. "You know, I agree," she replied. "It's just unusual, somehow. I don't know. I've never experienced anything like this before." "What about Manuel?" Pedro asked. "He also proposed to you, but you say there was nothing like that." "Well, everything with him was kind of usual and mundane," Eva reasoned, going over her previous experience in her mind. "I don't know. We were constantly afraid that his parents would interfere, that something else would happen, and as it turned out, not without reason. Did you think I expected everything to turn out like this? But, to be honest, I'm not even sure now if I ever really loved him. I think it was some kind of infatuation, at least on my part. From his side, it's understandable it was a matter of principle. What he hoped for, I have no idea. Anyway, let's not dwell on that. It's all in the past now." On the same day, Pedro asked Silvio to prepare invitations for friends, acquaintances, and business partners and to scout restaurants where they could celebrate the occasion. Strangely enough, Alice offered to help him with this. For several months, they had been communicating frequently. It all started with Silvio simply wanting to support the woman, but it ended with them building friendly and amicable relations. When Alice was married to Pedro, she saw Silvio exclusively as his assistant. Now, after the divorce, she looked at the man with completely different eyes. "Tell me honestly, aren't you upset at all?" he asked early on, when he was preparing the divorce papers. "After all, you've lived together for so many years and now you're getting divorced so banally and mundanely. Sorry, maybe I'm sticking my nose where it doesn't belong. We've known each other for a long time, but we've hardly ever talked. Maybe I have no right to ask you such questions." "Well, why not?" Alice replied. "Since you've asked, I'll answer. You see, our relationship had run its course. We only realized it when Pedro got sick. If that hadn't happened, we might have lived for many more years in this daily routine, which seems to have no end or purpose. What's the point of that? It's better to be a free person than to be tied down by the bonds of loveless marriage. That's firstly. And secondly, as far as I understand, Pedro has already started some new relationship there. I'm genuinely happy for him. Sooner or later, someone new will also come into my life. I'm more than sure of that." And Alice was right. In fact, such a person had long been in her life. Silvio had been in love with her ever since he started working for Senor Lagos, but he would never dare to show any signs of affection to his boss's wife. However, after the spouses divorced, he gradually began to court Alice. Silvio didn't expect reciprocity from her, he knew his place and hers. But he couldn't miss the opportunity to express his feelings to the woman he had loved for so long. It's better to be laughed at than to be branded a coward. And Alice appreciated that. Unlike Pedro, with whom she constantly faced chaos and problems, being with Silvio made her feel very calm. "Why didn't I notice you before?" she wondered. "You're such an extraordinary person. I don't even know how to put it into words." "I don't know," Silvio replied. "It's a rhetorical question, but, as they say, everything has its time." Alice never imagined that there would come a day in her life when she would be walking in the park with her ex-husband and his new wife, their children, and her new husband and son all together. It seemed utterly impossible to her, yet that day had come. 2 years after Pedro and Eva got married, their 2 daughters were born. "I never expected or imagined this," Pedro marveled. "I lived for so many years without a single child, and now suddenly there are 2. A real miracle." And a year later, Alice and Silvio's son was born. The woman never thought she would ever become a mother. She thought that topic was forever closed to her, so when her body started acting up, she didn't immediately consult a doctor. What pregnancy? She waved it off when Silvio immediately mentioned it as a possible cause of her discomfort. "I'm barren. I've lived for so many years without children, and now suddenly one appears? What nonsense." And how surprised and happy she was when the doctor told her she would soon become a mother. It was impossible to describe in words. "I'm happy for you, and for Silvio, of course, too," Pedro said when congratulating Alice on the birth of her son. "And I'm also very happy for you and Eva," the woman replied. And who would have thought that they were completely wrong for each other? From the outside, Alice and Pedro seemed like the perfect couple, but it turned out they were completely different people who wanted completely different things from life. It's a good thing they realized it in time and that life brought about an event that separated them, forever leading them in different directions. If that hadn't happened, Pedro would never have met Eva, and Alice would never have noticed Silvio, who had faithfully loved her for many years.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.